Thank you. I'm going to talk about BBR Prime, the implementation of the bottleneck bandwidth and round-trip time congestion control for ns-3. I'm Mark Claypool. I'm a faculty member at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. It's an engineering school just outside of Boston, USA. I did this work with Feng Li and Jay Chung. They're my colleagues at Verizon Labs. It's a research lab in Waltham, Massachusetts. TCP is the dominant protocol on the internet today. It was designed in an era of limited resources, specifically low network bandwidths and small queues, where TCP would increase the number of packets in flight until the queues filled, and the subsequent packet losses would be an indication of congestion. Today, router queue sizes can be large, so as TCP increases the number of packets and then subsequently fills the queue and drops packets, you're left with a bloated queue which increases round trip times. In addition, packet loss can also be not just from full queues, but also from wireless links. So the idea is to revisit the model of a congested link and see if TCP can be improved. This picture depicts a typical sender and receiver with a bottleneck link. The sender on the top is sending packets out, that sort of top bar. And those gray things are the packets. They're evenly spaced. In the first link, there's often extra capacity. Somewhere before hitting the receiver, though, you hit a link that's narrower, the bottleneck, and the packets start to backlog. There's a queue. And the packets then are congested as they go through the narrow link until they arrive at the receiver. The receiver, when it receives the packet, sends ACKs back to the sender. Typically, those are uncongested. So the way TCP works is it increases the amount of packets in flight, shown in the graph at the bottom. On the horizontal axis, as the packets in flight increase, the vertical axis shows the delivery rate. So from the left side, when there's 0 packets in flight, as you increase them, the packets received at the receiver, the delivery rate goes up, and linear, so linear in relation to the amount of packets in flight. At some point, and in fact at the point that that bottleneck link gets filled, the delivery rate flattens out. That's that green bar. Even if you increase the number of packets in flight, you don't increase the delivery rate. They're actually arriving as fast as possible. That's the horizontal green bar. And in fact, if you keep on increasing the number of packets in flight at the far right, you actually will fill up that queue at the bottleneck link, and the packets will be dropped. The round trip time also corresponds to the number of packets in flight. On this top graph, the round trip time is the vertical axis. And as the number of packets in flight increases from the left to that blue part, the round trip time stays the same. That's because the number of packets in flight aren't enough to actually fill up that bottleneck queue. When you hit that dashed line where the green bar is, the delivery rate is constant and the queue starts to fill up, and that increases the round trip time. In fact, that increases linearly to the far right when the queue is actually saturated and you drop packets. TCP cubic, the dominant version of TCP in the internet, operates at the far right of this graph. So it increases the number of packets in flight until packets are dropped. A better place to operate is not at the right side, but at this left side indicated by the circles, where you actually have the same delivery rate that we had at the right, but you have a lower round trip time. In fact, the minimum round trip time. This operating point is actually provably optimal by Gale and Kleinrock in '81, and it corresponds to the BDP, or the bandwidth delay product. That's the bottleneck bandwidth times the delay. So the BDP is the optimal operating point. And in order to determine that then, well, we have to figure out if you're a sender, you have to figure out what the maximum bandwidth is, what the minimum round trip time is. And these gray dots represent sort of mini experiments where you tried to measure that. And so on the top graph, we have all these dots kind of near the blue line. If we take the minimum round trip time that we measured, that red dot indicates the minimum, that will give us the minimum round trip time. And on the bottom graph on the right side, we have all these gray dots. If we take the maximum bandwidth that we observe, that will give us the maximum bandwidth. And those together then will give us the max bandwidth and the min round trip time. Multiplied together gets the BDP, and that will give us the optimal operating point. And so one trick though is that the minimum bandwidth is the minimum round trip time is only visible on the left side of that BDP packets in flight, and the maximum bandwidth is only visible on the right side. So any kind of observation, any kind of protocol would have to make sure you're observing on the left and the right in order to determine the BDP. And that's what BBR is trying to do, is to estimate this optimal point. BBR is the bottleneck bandwidth and round trip time protocol. developed by some of the research scientists depicted in this top right at Google. They have a paper in the Communications of the ACM in February 2017. BBR uses the model of the network we talked about, where every ACK is updating the maximum bandwidth and the minimum round trip time. And then it controls sending based on this model. So it probes for the maximum bandwidth, and it also probes for the minimum round trip time, and then it sends packets at a paced rate near this estimated bandwidth. And the idea is to keep the number of packets in flight near the BDP, where if done right, it will have high throughput with a small bottleneck queue. This is an outline of the rest of the talk. I'm going to show you a little bit more about BBR based on the specifications under the hood, and then I'll talk about BBR Prime, that's our implementation of BBR, followed by a bit of validation and then some evaluation and conclusions. BBR attempts to operate at that optimal point that we talked about earlier. The way it's going to do that is to walk towards it from the left side and try and stay at the operating point during steady state. So initially at startup, BBR does an exponential search to try and find where the optimal BDP point is. So these red dots indicate the steps it uses in changing the number of packets that are in flight. In some sense, this is similar to TCP slow start, where it will double the number of packets that are in flight, actually overshooting that optimal point until at the far right of this, you can see it's determined that it's clearly past the optimal point. BBR then goes into a drain state where it determines how many packets have been in-queued, have been built up in that bottleneck queue, and it drains those packets back to the operating optimal point. During the probe bandwidth state, it basically is staying at that optimal point. Occasionally it goes to the right side to explore whether the bottleneck bandwidth has increased. If it has, it will have a new operating point. If it hasn't, it'll drop back, draining that queue. Every once in a while, it needs to check if the minimum RTT has changed, and so greatly reduce the number of packets in flight to determine if there's a new minimal round trip time that it needs to pay attention to. Stepping back, we have this picture on the right of the BBR-State Machine, where again, we have sort of broadly two phases. You have the warm-up phase, where it goes through the startup and then the drain phase. And then you have the steady state phase where it's probing for maximum bandwidth most of the time, cruising. Every once in a while it drops into the probing for minimum RTT stage. So in the very bottom right of this graph, you see there's this, over time, the number of packets in flight, color-coded with that state machine, where the purple startup drain state is relatively small, ramps up, drains quickly, spends most of the time in the blue probe bandwidth state. Every once in a while goes into that pink probe RTT state. BBR version 1.0 is widely deployed at Google. There's open source releases for Linux, TCP, and QUIC, and it's been documented in IETF internet drafts. Preliminary performance results have showed promising benefits to both throughput and latency compared to TCP cubic. There's active work on BBR version 2.0, including these topics on the right, which I won't go over. In particular, though, the observation has been made that there is not and there was not a version of BBR for ns-3. So that's the goal of this paper, is BBR Prime, which is an implementation of BBR for ns-3. That's what I'm going to do next, is talk about the BBR Prime implementation. Then going into validation, evaluation, and conclusions. BBR Prime is implemented based on two IETF draft specifications. One is on the BBR congestion control. A second one is based on the delivery rate estimation, sort of the core of BBR. There are several challenges we needed to overcome to implement an ns-3. One is the protocol requires states. So to do that, we implemented a state machine that allows BBR Prime to move through the needed states. In addition, the BDP need to be computed. This, as in BBR, is done every time an ACK comes back. The delivery rate needs to be done, and this required us to add a hook in the send method to record data that's going out so that when the ACK came back, you can compute that bandwidth. The packet pacing was an initial challenge, which required us to implement pacing at the TCP layer. And the solution was to actually hijack outgoing packets so that they didn't go out immediately, but were put in a queue and later delivered at the pacing rate. I'll provide a brief overview of the BBR Prime implementation. It's depicted in these three groups of classes. BBR Prime is the blue box, which includes two classes. One is the TCP BBR class, that's the core protocol class, that uses the BBR State Machine class. That state machine is used to drive the BBR Prime states. It provides service for the several classes of applications. That's the bulk send application class that then has packets to send as fast as possible using BBR Prime and TCP. The TCP classes are the core TCP classes and ns-3 that need to be modified slightly in order to support BBR Prime. When TCP gets an ACK, it invokes packets ACKed in BBR Prime. And BBR Prime then uses this to update the round trip time and the bandwidth. BBR then computes and sets the pacing rate. The pacing rate is set in TCP. BBR Prime then computes the BDP based on the minimum round trip time and maximum bandwidth and sets that in the CWIND in TCP. When the device is ready to send a packet, it makes a call back to the application. The bulk send application then calls TCP send, sort of a normal TCP send, providing one or more segments packets for TCP to send. While TCP would normally send these, because we've done pacing, this send is hijacked and the packet is instead enqueued to be sent later. And that actually is ready to send based on the pacing rate, and it's set by an ns-3 timer. So when the timer goes off, it actually calls pace packets, which will actually then tell BBR, hey, I'm sending a packet, and allow it to do some bookkeeping. Remember that hook into the send method. And then it will actually send the packet after that normally. That's a high-level overview of BBR Prime implementation. There's a few more details in the paper and the tech report, and of course details can be found in the code itself. That's a brief overview of the BBR Prime implementation. I'm going to talk about validation next. In order to validate BBR Prime, we took published performance results for BBR from the CACM paper I mentioned earlier and compared those with an identical configuration, identical setup for BBR Prime in the ns-3 simulator. So the environment is a single flow with a bottleneck link of 10 megabits per second and a 40 millisecond round trip time. The left side of this slide shows the published graph. There's three separate lines: round trip time at the top, in-flight in the middle, and bandwidth at the bottom. The right three graphs are the corresponding BBR Prime measurements for the same configuration in ns-3. So the round trip time, you can see, stays at the minimum for BBR, and as BBR probes for bandwidth, there's these spikes, these little tents. BBR Prime does the same thing. The in-flight packets, they correspond to those increased RTTs. That's the number of packets that are increased, and BBR and BBR Prime look the same for that. And then the actual delivered bandwidth is in the bottom graph, the red graph. The fidelity of the measurements in the CACM paper are finer grained, so we have sort of more wiggles in the lines, if you will. But on the right, the BBR Prime graphs look the same. And that's the takeaway, is that visually, BBR Prime looks similar to BBR. Looking at additional published results, the same CACM paper shows the same bottleneck bandwidth looked at before. This time, though, the capacity changes from 10 megabits per second at time 20. It doubles to 20 megabits per second. On the left is the published result. On the right is the BBR Prime configuration in ns-3. So what happens when the bandwidth doubles is that probing for bandwidth, the number of in-flight packets, increases. That's that green line going up at 20 seconds, reaching roughly the new bandwidth, the new number of BDP packets in flight at about 22 seconds. And at that stage, it's at steady state. And again, the BBR Prime results on the right do the same, where the RTT skin stays at the minimum. That's the blue line, and the green number of packets in flight doubles from 20 to 22. The corresponding published results show an abrupt decrease in bandwidth. At time 40, the bottleneck bandwidth goes from 20 milliseconds to 10 milliseconds. Again, on the left are the published results, and on the right are the BBR Prime results in ns-3. And what happens here is when the bandwidth halves, the number of packets in flight actually is too many. You're trying to get too many packets in flight for the bandwidth, and it'll actually reach a maximum. That's actually capped by the limit on the sea wind. And so it sort of caps at the top part. Once the maximum bandwidth is timed out in that maximum bandwidth window, it then starts to decrease the number of packets in flight, reaching the new steady state about 4 seconds after that abrupt bandwidth change. On the right side, BBR prime does about the same thing, where the RTT again increases its maximum cap and then decreases at time 44. It's about the same. So again, from these graphs, BBR prime appears to operate similarly to BBR. So next I'm going to show some evaluation results where we took BBR prime through some preliminary performance under a few different scenarios. We first compared BBR prime to cubic in a wired environment with a bottleneck link of 20 megabits per second and a minimum round trip time of about 22 milliseconds. The left graph shows throughput for the first 3 seconds of a bulk download flow, where the red line is BBR prime and the blue line is cubic. Both BBR prime and cubic quickly reach the bottleneck bandwidth of 20 megabits per second and stay there throughout the 3 seconds. The middle graph shows the queue capacity. Again, blue is cubic and red is BBR, where cubic hits the capacity limit of 60 packets and stays there throughout. BBR hits that in the early phases, but then drains that queue and stays near the minimum queue, with those little spikes being when it's probing for more bandwidth. The round trip time on the right is reflective of that queue, where cubic, the blue line again, with that full queue has a higher RTT of about 55 milliseconds. BBR prime is close to that 22 millisecond minimum. So overall, BBR has similar throughput to cubic, but a lower RTT. We next looked at BBR prime versus cubic in a wireless environment, specifically 4G LTE, where we replaced that router and bottleneck link with a packet gateway and an eNode B connected to the client, now a UE or sort of like a smartphone. The LTE parameters are on the right, where we controlled the signal strength in this case using the distance of the UE to the cell tower. The throughput graph there on the bottom is on the left, with again cubic is the blue, and cubic reaches about 12 megabits per second in this case, similar to red, the BBR prime line, over the 5 seconds we've recorded. The round trip time is the graph on the right, where again cubic has a fuller queue, resulting in a round trip time of about 100 milliseconds, 0.1 seconds. The red BBR line has a lower RTT of about 50 milliseconds or so at steady state. So these results for 4G LTE broadly look similar to those in the wired environment. If we extend this by looking at the same scenario but under a variety of different distances, we can get these two graphs on this page, where now we varied the UE from 0, so kind of right next to the cell tower, up to 20 kilometers away from the cell tower. And so the horizontal axis in these graphs is that distance in meters. And the vertical axis for the left graph is throughput, and then for the right graph is round trip time. And for the left graph, the throughputs of BBR prime and cubic are similar. They basically, for each scenario, seem to have about the same throughput. On the right side, though, is the round trip time. And you can see that, again, for a very close scenario, the round trip times are similar. But as the distance gets further away, cubic's round trip time, caused by that full queue at the congested link, increases, sort of the maximum of about 500 milliseconds on the far right, where BBR prime is able to maintain a relatively low queue. So to conclude, networks are evolving, and that requires, not surprisingly, evolutions to TCP. BBR is promising, the protocol by Google, but it needs more vetting, more testing. ns-3 is a great simulator for doing vetting, but didn't have BBR implemented. So this paper is a BBR prime, an implementation of BBR for ns-3. Again, it uses existing congestion control code base. It's already in ns-3, and it allows it to integrate with other ns layers. For validation, broadly speaking, BBR prime looks like BBR. So the validation results look promising. In performance evaluation compared to cubic, BBR prime tends to get similar throughput, but has lower round trip time. I wanted to acknowledge a couple of grad students that worked on this with me, sort of early implementation, Apurva Lad and Chengal Zhang for the early work on the protocol development. There's some interesting future work aspects. One is to incorporate a few more BBR features. Right now, BBR Prime expects every flow to be throughput bound, so it's sending as fast as possible. Some applications don't do that, and BBR, the specification, has some ideas on how to handle that. In addition, some adverse internet conditions such as packet reordering and ACK loss could be incorporated into BBR Prime. Some of the parameters could use adjustments. I think there's BBR, again, could use embedding, and you can do that in simulation. Things about the pacing, things about the gain rates. In addition, there's more about network conditions that can be evaluated over. So competing network stacks, so not just one kind of TCP stack. You can compare Wi-Fi with LTE and other sorts of wireless environments, 5G, there's some papers on 5G at this conference. In addition, queue sizes, so what happens with really small queues. There's been some observed anomalous behavior for BBR on small queues, and also when they're super large. That's the end of my talk on BBR Prime, an implementation of the bottleneck bandwidth round trip time congestion control protocol for ns-3. I'm Mark Claypool. You can find a link to our paper, a longer tech report version, and the Git repository with our code at this URL. Thanks.